slight shuffle of people. I hope more come in. It would be great to have everybody in the room as possible, as many people as possible, for Matt Nordan, who I've known for a good long time. I first met Matt, I guess it was 2010 or 2011, when I was raising funds for a venture of my own. And he struck me as one of the most, if not the most thoughtful people that I interacted with. He had a tremendous sort of desire to do right, not just move money, and was incredibly engaged with the technology and the way that that might develop and how it ought to go forward. He gave me some very pointed advice in those days that I took to heart and wish I listened to more, it turns out. Matt is a managing director of Prime. It's an impact fund and early stage venture capital focused on venture cap, climate, and innovation. He has led venture investments in more than a dozen startups and has spent 20 years focused on cutting edge technologies as an investor, analyst, and advisor. In addition to Prime, Matt is co-founder and managing partner at MNL Partners, which develops energy and environmental projects in China. Matthew also co-founded and serves on the board of the Prime Coalition, Prime Impact Fund's nonprofit parent organization. Matthew has testified before U.S. Congress 4 times on emerging technology issues, was a founding member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Emerging Technologies, and is a widely sought-after speaker and commentator. He serves on the board of Lilac Solutions, Sense Labs, QuidNet Energy, and Greentown Labs, the world's largest incubator for energy and environmental companies. Matthew graduated from Yale, where he conducted cognitive neuroscience research on emotion and memory. So without further ado, Matt Nordan.
How you doing? Doing all those sparks of life there in this room. This is exciting to me. So you, after this, are going to go to reception where you will be fueled with alcohol to make meaningful professional connections. My job now is to fuel you with hope and optimism, for a sector where there can be a bit of downerism, right? You've heard a lot of this, that this can be a difficult field to invest in, that we need to approach it on different sorts of terms, that there was a flirtation with traditional venture capital in the field that didn't go well. I want you to recognize all that and also forget it. Because the thing that we're able to do as creative beings with agency is not to accept our future, but to change it and to shape it. And I want to talk to you about how there's an interesting tribe of folks approaching investing in energy and environment in a different way, and that I think we have the opportunity to shape our own future. But to get there, to go through the arc, we need to start with a little bit of history. And I want to give you a whirlwind tour of the history of venture capital funding in energy and environment, what's sometimes called Cleantech. And if you look through, say, the mid-90s through 2005, you would conclude that about $500 million of money went into this field every year, roughly split evenly between initial investment, so the first money that new companies took, and then follow-on investment that came in later rounds. But around 2005, everything changed. There was this perfect storm of good stuff. The Kyoto Protocol was ratified in 2005, creating an expectation that we might have global pricing on CO2. Oil hit a peak north of $100 per barrel toward the end of 2017. The price of natural gas hung out around $12 per million BTU, had not yet been impacted by fracking. And you can see what happened here, right? Investment in this field skyrocketed to like 8 times its normal level per year. I think the triggering event for me was Q4 of 2005, when 3 solar companies all went public on major exchanges, all at valuations around $1 billion, all within 60 days of one another. And at that point, every VC conference that I went to, people were just jumping out of their skin to figure out how they could invest in energy tech. And a predictable mentality followed. Everything got funded, right? We got flying cars, we got smart meters, we got thin film solar, we got fuel cells. That company's still around. People have talked about them today. I'll reserve my opinions. We got printouts at the end of your electricity bill shaming you into using less power. We got flying solar-powered drones. We got algae-based biofuels. We got everything, right? From 2004 through 2013, $25 billion went into more than 1,000 new startup companies, all from institutional venture investors, the same people who brought you Facebook and Apple. But then what happened? Well, you might look at sort of the anti-perfect storm starting on September 15th of 2008 when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, presaging the financial crisis that followed. What happened? The green line here is the Dow, right? It tanked by half, eventually came back, but it took 5 years. What else happened? Waxman-Markey, legislation in the US Congress that would have implemented CO2 pricing in the country, failed. And we began a pullback from that commitment to the Kyoto Protocol that had happened years beforehand. What else happened? The price of oil cratered. It went down by more than half. Then popped back up, stabilized around 60, 70 bucks per barrel. It's now around 30 to 40. And natural gas got impacted by fracking, dropped to a low of around $2 per million BTU. Today hangs around 3 or 4. What happened to investment in this field? Well, for a year, it kind of dropped like a rock. Then the absolute numbers popped back up. But look at the difference here between first-time financing and follow-on financing. People were not investing in new companies in this category. They were plowing bad money behind good in like the Series H round of Bloom Energy or something like that. And then the trend went like that. And by the time you got to 2016, the National Venture Capital Association, which pays bean counters to track this stuff, put out in their Q2 2016 report these numbers. That orange line that you see is follow-on financings in energy tech companies that got their first financing 5 or 10 years beforehand. That red line at the bottom is new investment in new startups from institutional VCs. $0.00 in Q2 of 2016 is not a typo. That persisted in Q3, and in Q4, the bean counters stopped counting the category. So, I promised hope and optimism. I am sucking so far. But we have to understand why this happened, right? And why this happened is that when you're investing in industrial technologies, things that hurt when you drop them on your foot, and are made by the likes of GE and Siemens, it's just a different proposition. It's more time, it's more money, and it's more risk than venture capital in general. Take as your counterexample something like Instagram, acquired in the 3rd year of its life for $1 billion with 13 employees and about $13 million invested. You cannot beat that capital efficiency. And if that's the opportunity cost of your dollar, there will be a giant sucking sound of these software-based sort of app-type companies sucking that capital toward them. It's totally okay to laugh. I see people like hiding smirks. Totally fine. This field, in many ways, is kind of like biotech, but with the out-the-exit model, where it can take 10 or 15 years to bring something that's a hard tech innovation to market, but you don't get bought for $5 billion by GlaxoSmithKline when you finish phase 1 clinical trials. First, there's no GlaxoSmithKline, and second, there aren't any clinical trials. Now, there is an exception to this rule, sort of software-based companies that touch energy and natural resources. Sometimes this corner of the universe is referred to as clean web. It's a nice corner. I've had personally a good time in this corner, but it's a small corner, and there are not many things in it. When you think about what in the main we've discussed in this room today, right, it's just a different proposition. For Tesla to go from founding to being public, that was $350 million of equity capital, plus another $350 million of government-backed debt, right? Those are huge sums of money. For First Solar, the first big American solar success to get to an outcome, it was $150 million, but it was also 16 years. Company was founded in 1990 as Glass Tech, bootstrapped itself for 12 years until the point that it shipped the first product, brought on $150 million of Wilton money from 99 through 2006, big sum of capital from one far-reaching investor. But it was a really good investment. Right? Wilton was 8.4 times their money the day the company went public. At the stock market peak in 2008, they were 199 times their $150 million. So what do we learn from this? I guess we learned that if you're playing by one rule book, right, if you're playing by the Instagram, Snapchat investing rule book, and you actually expect to see big upticks, and/or a run at public markets in a 5-year or less time frame, you do not want to be involved in this category. But if you have a longer-term vision and you don't have that opportunity cost to your dollar, calling something a failure in that time frame is kind of like calling the ball game in the 5th inning. You could do it, but you're probably wrong. And I think what's beautiful about 2019 is that there is a new tribe of investors who are coming at this space on its own terms, and who in many cases have either some secondary motivation to their capital that creates a return that's not purely financial, or they have a creative model that allows them to make some end runs around the challenges of doing traditional venture investing in this field. As some examples, Energize Ventures in the Midwest, solely going after asset-light companies that don't have to spend a lot of money to build big manufacturing facilities and stuff like that. They can do it on other people's balance sheets. Very good idea. We have a series of strategic funds, the most notable of which are Clear Sky and Energy Impact Partners, whose limited partners, the people who give them the money they get to invest, are all utilities or energy companies or other folks who have a strategic motivation to deploy capital in addition to their financial one. We have some really cool new models. Abe Yokel and Josh Posamentire of Congruent Ventures on the West Coast have come up with a model where they partner with later stage funds who can help them get investment returns at an early stage without getting washed out if they can't invest more and more money in the same companies later on. The Orange Man in the White House is not really helping us on this front, but there are a bunch of interesting cross-border investors from places in the world where electricity and other resources are a lot more expensive, who have figured out how to channel money into Western startups. 1955 in San Francisco is a good example of that. We have place-based investors like Clean Energy Trust that is all about seed stage investing in the Midwest. We have patient investors who don't have the constraints of normal investment funds like True North Venture Partners, a Wilton family money vehicle that is actually structured as a holding company, which can buy companies and hold them forever if they want to, a lot like Warren Buffett might do. And then there's the case that I'm here to talk about as a case study, which is Prime Impact Fund, the organization that I spend most of my time with today. To tell you how we got here, let me tell you a little story. So during that whole, clean tech boom bust traditional venture investing thing, where was I? I was at one of those venture firms. I had a 12-year career in the technology analyst world. I started and ran the largest tech analyst firm focused on energy and environment called Lux Research. And I was recruited out of that into a venture shop called Venrock that is arguably the oldest venture capital firm, originally formed in the 1930s as the venture arm of the Rockefeller family. These are the people who brought you names ranging from Boeing to United Airlines to Intel to Apple. And my colleagues and I built a portfolio of 9 energy tech companies over about 5 years, 1.5 fund cycles. I tried my damnedest to invest in Jay Whitacre, totally failed. He wouldn't have me. I felt kind of spurned, but it's cool. We're friends. Our biggest hit in that portfolio was Nest, right? Founded 2010, shipped product within 12 months, had saved 1 billion kilowatt hours of energy, almost entirely in the US by 2013, bought by Google in 2014 for $3.2 billion, the largest single venture-backed outcome in this space, a little less than twice the size of Tesla's valuation at IPO. We came in the last private round. We were 4 times our money in 16 months. Those types of internal rates of return almost never happened. We had other hits in this portfolio, a company called Lucid Motors that is a Tesla killer optimized for the Chinese market, which means the car is optimized for the rear seat experience because if you can afford the car, you have a driver, that took $1.3 billion from the Saudi Public Investment Fund last fall in a transaction that valued the company a little over $2 billion. So that was all great. And I should have felt good about it, but I didn't because it's not what I had gone there to do. I was running a little revolution versus reform experiment to see could you back breakthrough hard technology startups in energy at the earliest stages out of a conventional venture fund if it had a particularly long history and a particularly long leash. And the answer, for good reasons, from partners who were really smart and taught me a ton, was no. And that reason's what we talked about beforehand, right? When the opportunity cost of the dollar was Instagram or Snapchat, and I showed up at the Monday morning meeting and said, guys, and they were all guys. I don't think there was a woman in the partnership at that point. Guys, it's a plant, but it doesn't make wood, it makes electricity. Or guys, it's an antenna, but it tunes heat into power. The answer would always be the same. We would always pass. And it's not that we weren't interested. We liked the people, we liked the technology, but there was just too much risk and too much time, and we thought they should come back 2 or 3 years later, right? After somebody else has gone first and de-risked this really good idea. Well, those same people would then go down the street to Sequoia and then go down the street to Kleiner Perkins, and when they passed, if you're a brilliant young thing out of CMU or MIT or Stanford, you don't beat your head against the wall forever. You eventually give up and go work at Google X. So I was worried that we would lose both a generation of technologies that could contribute to averting climate change and scaling the world for 15 billion people who eat beef and drive cars, but more so about losing a generation of you, a generation of innovators and entrepreneurs that are the bright sparks that ignites the motor, right? I didn't have an answer for this, but I knew I needed to do something different. At a Venrock partner meeting on a Monday morning, I was in New York for this, and it was a very rare Monday where we had not one but two companies come in and do the big final pitch to the full presentation, after which there would be an investment decision. First company comes in, it's a hard tech company, not even quite in my category, but sort of hardware-based, super amazing founders, awesome angel investors, oversubscribed Kickstarter, just lots of things, big green lights. They get done, we sit around the table and debate it. The four general partners who own the firm are like, this is really cool, and we would have done it a year ago, but our next fund is going to be mostly sort of really asset-light, software-type companies. And we don't want to telegraph things we're going to do in the next fund by doing other stuff as the last few investments in this fund, so we're going to pass. Second company comes in. Two female co-founders, they're both British. The company is called Lulu. They have made an iPhone app targeted at sorority girls at party schools to rate guys on dimensions, including their anatomy. Get done with that one, partnership debates. We decide we have to do the entire $10 million Series A on a $40 million pre-money valuation because they cannot leave New York without a term sheet. I leave that meeting, I go to a conference room. First thing I do, I make a phone call. It's to my wife, and I'm like George Costanza in that Seinfeld episode. I'm like, I am done. I have nothing to do here at this point. Second call, though, was to a brilliant young woman out of MIT named Sarah Carney, who had previously run a small family foundation that granted to energy tech research in university settings like this one. Sarah had then done a master's degree in systems engineering at MIT, and her colleagues studied things like the payment system or the transportation system. The system she studied was philanthropy. We had gotten to know each other over the years, and 2 weeks before this partner meeting, she had sat across a table from me and said, Matthew, I think I have the answer as to how you fund these early breakthrough energy tech ideas in an appropriate way. And what came out of that conversation was that as of that morning in 2013, U.S. family foundations alone, forget corporate foundations, donor-advised funds, the other 200-odd countries in the rest of the world. Just U.S. family foundations alone had $600 billion in assets. That was about 4 times bigger than the entire venture capital asset class on that morning. $50 billion of which went out in grants every year. And despite the fact that these foundations had almost universally, right, environmental protection, human equity, global health as part of their mandate. And despite the fact that they have special financial tools available only to them, called program-related investments and recoverable grants that allow you to take a dollar that you would have granted, which does not have a concept of taxation, and invest it in an early-stage company, provided that you can show that it's in line with your mission and the investment would not have been made but for the philanthropic motive. Despite all of that, none of this money was in the game. And she got across to me, I think we have the opportunity to figure out how to mobilize this capital source that's almost custom built to build and grow breakthrough climate-focused tech companies. And 2 weeks beforehand, I had told her, I think it's really interesting. I'd love to be an advisor to you, really not something I'd buddy up with you on. In that conference room, I said, remember all that stuff I said 2 weeks ago? Forget that. We're going to do this. So we set this 501c3 nonprofit up called Prime Coalition in 2014. And we realized the first thing we needed to do was to figure out an existence proof. Could we mobilize this capital source for these problems? And I want to tell you quickly the story of our first investment that I think probably gets across best what it is we're trying to accomplish. I had gotten really interested, at Venrock and beforehand about grid-scale energy storage as sort of the problem you had to solve if you wanted to take coal and natural gas plants off the grid. And there's a company I'd seen at the time that really intrigued me. It was called TerraStore at the time. The founder was a Saudi Aramco reservoir engineer named Howard Schmidt. And his big simple insight was that when you do a fracking job, you do half of an energy storage job. You take a bunch of electricity, you put it in a pump, you pressurize water, you jam it underground. At first it fractures the rock, right? But then you exceed the fracture stress gradient of the reservoir, and from then on you don't fracture the rock anymore, you compress it like a spring. And the rock pushes back on you. And how do you know that? Because when you're done with your fracking job, you turn off your pump, flowback water starts spewing out on the other side of your valve. And his insight was that if you could find reservoirs, and it turns out there are a whole lot of them, like a quarter of what's underground in the earth, that had a very low leak-off rate in the right geology, you could do pumped hydroelectric energy storage, but do it underground, storing energy in the form of pressurized water in the earth that God gave you for free. And why would you do that? Because your cost per kilowatt hour of energy stored could be an order of magnitude lower than even the most optimistic projections for lithium-ion batteries. I saw this when I was at Venrock and I passed. Same story, come back in 2 or 3 years, great idea. But the first use of funds you have is to go out to a carefully selected reservoir somewhere in Texas and start jamming water underground. And if you crack the rock open, you will blow $1 or $2 million like between 9 and 10 a.m. So come back after somebody else funded that, right? And same deal, the company languished. It sort of, hung out, dying on the vine. It became Prime's first investment. We ended up doing 3 seed tranches of $500,000 each. The first one involved 4 impact investors from our network, pretty wide-ranging. We also had extensive in-kind services, so free field work from Halliburton. If that sounds kind of like being part of the Rebel Alliance with your good friend Darth Vader, that's how it felt. And what did we do? We went out to a carefully selected site in Erath County, Texas, where from what I can tell, there is a lot of cattle and meth labs. And these guys, okay to laugh, these folks in their coveralls, came out and started jamming water underground. And what we found was a surprise. We had 3 figures of merit we needed to demonstrate in order to show techno-economics that supported this order of magnitude lower cost than battery technology, and they were all exceeded. This is a slide from the board deck that came afterward. It's rare that you get upside surprises the first time you try something in hard technology. This was one of those rare upside surprises. But we had shown that we had done it once. And we're proposing, right, to use geologic reservoir as a 20 or 40-year asset. So you have to show under accelerated sort of testing conditions that it's resilient, that when you store and release, you're not degrading the rock every time you do it. So we did a second seed tranche. It involved one of the impact investors from the first round and Clean Energy Venture Group, a sort of most bold of the angels energy tech investing group in Boston. Again, Halliburton assisted with in-kind services. What we then did over 9 months was 47 serial pressurizations and depressurizations of the reservoir. So you take all the water out, put all the water back in, store, release, store, release, store, release, put all the water back out, and do that over 9 months of seasonality. And you're then looking at pressure curves of measured pressure on the inside of that reservoir and seeing if it's going down over time, indicating that the rock is getting degraded. Those curves look like this. It is rare in life that you see like 0.95 r squareds on something, that involves part of, God's given terra firma, but that's what we saw in this case. We then raised a third seed tranche, CVG returned, and 2 impact investors. And the primary use of funds was to hire a CEO, a gentleman named Joe Zhou, an extraordinary young man, who had run business development at a lithium-ion battery energy storage company called Engie. Sorry, not Engie. That's who bought them. Called Green Charge, which was bought by a European utility, Engie. Joe's only flaw is that he looks like he's about 12 years old. The other steps were to develop a detailed techno-economic model and a commercial project plan where we actually went out and secured a buyer for the power from the first plant and a project financier, really a sort of upper decile one, who would fund the debt component of a first project. On that basis, Joe then went out to raise a Series A round. His job was to do that by end of year 2018. That was actually raised in May of 2018, co-led by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is the billionaire club, long-term energy tech fund backed by Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Jack Ma, and 20 other billionaires, and Evoke Innovations, clean energy tech fund backed by 2 Canadian tar sands companies who are looking for technologies that can enable a future for them beyond hydrocarbon extraction. This is what we're trying to do. Find things that are needy but deserving, a little too early, a little too risky for venture. Everybody believes that somebody should fund it at the early stage, just not me. I want to come back in 2 or 3 years. And bring a capital source that has an appropriate, right, level of mission alignment, risk tolerance, and long time frame that's well suited to funding these companies. That was the first thing we did. Over the next 3 years, we then backed 9 other companies this way, mobilizing in total a little north of $25 million from 56 different foundations and philanthropists. These companies are all in very different sectors. What they have that's common to them is a potentially gigaton scale impact on CO2 equivalent emissions. And Firo does that by decreasing the energy that's involved in reverse osmosis and enabling distributed desalination and water reuse. Rebound does that by changing the input source of energy in heating and cooling from electricity to waste heat. Opus 12 does that through reverse combustion, where you take CO2 out of a clean stream, maybe ultimately out of the air, and combust it in reverse. Turning it into a useful fuel or a chemical, in their case in a membrane electrode assembly. The next step for us that we started about a year ago is putting together a proper long-term fund. It's called Prime Impact Fund, that pools capital into a blind pool with a full-time team to invest in these companies in a more programmatic way with a lot of hands-on help. And our 3 underwriting criteria are the 3 things you see here: gigaton scale, transformative climate impact potential, unlikely to raise capital without us, attractive to follow-on investors if these companies can be de-risked on our dollars. We've made our first 3 investments out of the fund. We've got a 4th that should get queued up sometime in Q2. And so far, so good. That's us. I hope what this has given you is one case, and one case out of many, right? We have philanthropically motivated peers at places like Clean Energy Trust and Radical Impact. We have investors with much deeper pockets than we do, who we can collaborate or who can follow on to us at places like Breakthrough Energy Ventures. Strategic investors have become great friends. It was awesome to hear Barbara's discussion. That's exactly the kind of partner that we want to be able to work with on companies that can benefit from the strategic insight and the access to market that large corporations have. I hope this gives you some optimism. That in the same way, if you were a creative entrepreneur in the 1930s, there wasn't any venture capital, right? If you wanted to raise money, you had 2 options. You had banks or rich guys. And if banks and rich guys didn't listen, there were sort of no doors to knock on. But that, absence of capital for some was an opportunity for others. And a small number of visionary, forward-thinking families, J.H. Whitney, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, others, started pooling capital into what we now call the venture capital asset class, that then was considered kind of crazy. Like if you went to the person who managed Harvard's or Yale's or CMU's endowment in the 1950s and said, "Do you have any money in venture capital?" they would first tell you, "What is this venture capital you speak of?" But secondly, once you explained it, they would say, "Am I crazy? Do I look like a gambler? Do I take the university's money and spin it on the roulette wheel? Hell no." But today, if you went to those people, all of them would say, "Am I crazy? Did I not go to business school? Of course I understand that in order to get the outsized returns of being in Facebook early, the only way to do that is to have a prudent and appropriate amount of capital in these early stage high-risk ventures." We think that philanthropy is ready for the same kind of transformation, and that there's a huge pool of capital, multiples larger than the VC asset class, that with some changes in behavior can view it as important and rewarding and in line with mission to have a small allocation of this very large pool dedicated to bringing forth new ventures that have social impact, and if they're successful, will be big, important, and lucrative companies as well. That's it. I think we got a little bit of time for a question or 2. Great to talk to you today, and I look forward to having a drink with you in a little bit. Thanks.
So Matthew, we have a couple of questions, and we do have a little bit of space for more questions if anyone has any. I think we were also captivated by your talking that no one was typing, and that's a good thing. So,
Gotcha, okay.
So a question I have here is, what has been the success rate of the clean tech companies you've invested in?
Oh, me personally? I had to do this recently because whenever you have investors signing up to like look at a fund, they ask for your personal internal rate of return, and it's actually a difficult calculation to do, and not something that I could speak out in a forum like this one. Look, the general rule, right, in venture is that if you look at the kind of rule of thumb, it's that about a third of all venture investments go to zero, right? Third of them, you make your money back. You're like, 1x plus or minus, but accounting for the time value of money, you lost a little bit. And about a third have some measure of success. And if you run math pretty quickly, you find that the only way you get to a winning portfolio is that out of 10 investments, at least one of them has to return probably 10 times your money. Because there's no other way, accounting for the time lag from when you invest and when you get returns, and the fact that the investment managers have got to, be able to eat and have an office. That takes some of the money up along the way too, to be able to be competitive with long-term stock market returns. If you ask the question, okay, so that makes sense. How often do venture funds in general return capital? Right? How often do the people who put the money in get the money back? It's actually really low. The National Venture Capital Association maintains statistics on this, and only about 1 in 5 venture funds makes money. So in the same way that most startups fail, most venture investors also fail. That success rate has been a lot lower in these industrial technology categories for the reason that we talked about, in part, right? That it's more time, more money, more risk, sort of less gross margin to go around. When somebody sells a drug at the end of the value chain, sells a pharmaceutical to you, they've got like a 90-95% gross margin on that pill. When GE or Siemens sells a turbine, they might have like a 25-30% gross margin on that turbine. There's just kind of less profit to go around everybody, right? But I do think a second aspect of this is that companies had a real disservice done to them by having the conventional venture model applied to them in a way where decisions made at the companies may have been made as much or more to serve the investors than they were made in order to ensure that companies were successful. I saw over and over again in the last 10 years startups that were probably kind of not ready to move from innovation to productizing too quickly because it served the investor's motivation, maybe not the company and the founder's motivation. Companies going from building a little bit of manufacturing to large-scale manufacturing for the same reasons, because the investors needed things to go fast and to kind of compress something into their model. But when you're trying to put 15 pounds of potatoes in a 10-pound bag, somebody is unhappy. And I think there was a lot of that, and that investments that are done on a more purpose-built basis that take this field on its own terms are likely to have a higher success rate.
I have another question, Matt. So you're taking the prime. One of the key things is the source of your money is largely from philanthropic funds or family offices. Is their sense of failure different? And I say this from personal experience. Some of the money that I've raised for Acquion was from family offices, and at one point I talked to one of the the rich people, and they said, "Well, what happened to all that?" And of course we had sold at a loss, major, definitely a crater in the ground. But what happened to the people and with your people, and how do they? Are there other companies? What else is going on? So I had described sort of how that all went. And their response was, "Oh, my money was not wasted. There was other things that happened, and I believe that even though financially I did not benefit from this investment, I believe that the ecosystem of energy storage has benefited, and therefore it's not a bad thing." Is this a common mindset or not?
We filter for that mindset, I'd put it that way. Look, we have one overriding principle in Prime Impact Fund, right? There's one thing that defines success to us, one and one only, and it is vastly reduced greenhouse gas emissions. That is success. We believe that in order to have an impact and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the companies that we fund need to be sustainable, successful, large-scale, important, attractive to follow-on investors. So they need to be successful companies. without getting into the arcana of the fact that we're a relatively small fund, we can only invest early, that means there's some risk that the company might be successful, our investment might not. We are unapologetically impact first. There is no better way to screen for the type of people that you've described versus the type of people who might sort of talk the talk of being impact driven but not walk it, which is not bad, by the way. It's just different. Those just aren't the people we're looking for. They're very good people, just not our people. The best way to do that is to put a slide in your deck where the heading is something like, so is this fund going to return capital? And put underneath it, probably not. Probably going to launch a bunch of really important companies. But difficult category, 1 out of 5 venture funds makes money anyway. Longer time frame, higher level of risk, only able to invest early. Every effort and iota of energy that we have is toward getting this asymmetric impact and financial outcome, but that is not the most likely scenario, and you should be aware of that. That's a great sorting mechanism. So we try to be whiter than snow about what defines success for us and about the inherent risks of the field.
Very cool that you're funded Right Electric. I just had a question on what SoftBank's Vision Fund might do in the energy space.
Yep.
Right. So basically, they're investing obscene amounts of capital.
Yeah, sure. They got a big chunk of change.
So I was wondering what you think about sort of the role of artificial intelligence and how that might be able to accelerate startups that sort of die.
So I think two separate ideas there. One of them is whether it's SoftBank's Vision Fund, which is the world's first $1 billion venture capital fund. They're almost there, like super close. $100 billion fund. Jesus, what am I thinking? Those are two important, orders of magnitude. How do you deploy that much money? You have to deploy it in big chunks. So we look at either that, or Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a $1 billion vehicle, or a variety of others, as folks who need to write in the main, large checks. They may write some small checks, but in the main, they've got to write larger checks. And they're great partners, for us and our peer group. So that's awesome. When it comes to one of the investment focus areas of SoftBank Vision Fund, which is AI generally, I think there's a little bit of, arm waving here, and that every software company I see now has rebranded itself as an AI company. So let's put that aside. But when you think about, real deep learning techniques as applied to problems where you have a lot of data and a short enough feedback loop, right, for real learning to take place, that's becoming part of the essential toolkit of every company that we work with. And the fact that there now is such a profusion of software companies marketing their capabilities as a service, it makes it really economical to tap into those tools at companies that never would have possibly conceived, right, of having things that would have beforehand been very expensive labor with very relatively long learning cycles to be replaced by a service with extremely short learning cycles. I think there can be a lot of starry-eyed vision in that, as I mentioned beforehand, you have to have a meaningful amount of data and relatively short learning cycles in order for those techniques to be relevant. Not relevant to some of our companies, hugely relevant to others.
More questions?
Okay.
What type of clean tech company are you looking to invest in the next year?
Interesting question. Sector-wise, we have no bias at all. We don't really care about that. What do we care about? Our gating factor is if it's successful from a climate perspective, does it matter a lot or a little? For landscaping here, right? The IPCC numbers would tell us that we need to mitigate 70 gigatons a year of emissions by 2050 at the latest to avert catastrophe, right? 70 gigatons. Of that, about half we get just by deploying more of stuff that already works. So more solar, more wind, that's how you get 35. The other half, though, has to come from new stuff. Things either discovered or not developed, or developed and not deployed, right? That's where our focus is. So you've got 35 gigatons a year of units you need to fill. How big does something have to be to make a difference? Well, all wind power ever built is on the order of like 1.5 gigatons a year. So that ends up being our mark. Can something be at the same level at full deployment, similar to what wind is today? That means there are a lot of things that are really interesting, awesome companies with badass founders that are great for other investors. They're not a match to our core criterion. For example, I looked recently at a company that was a sort of novel abatement technique, focused on mitigating methane emissions at the source, but their total universe was in like the tens to hundreds of megatons range if they abated all, right, of their feedstock of emissions. Really important, somebody should do it, not, we think, the highest and best use of this scarce philanthropic capital. The second thing that we care about is badass, extraordinary, run through walls, do the right thing for its own sake, persistent, energetic founders. Great things don't happen because you've got some really cool technology. The really cool technology rarely wins. Great things don't happen when there's a big market where a rising tide lifts all boats. If you get in at that point, it's probably too late. There's truism to the venture adage that venture success just depends on extraordinary people. And that was a really difficult thing for me to take on board. I'm a really fact-based, research-driven guy, so I wanted okay, what's like the checklist of badassery that, if you score 55 or higher, then you pass. And it's not that. It's very subjective. I think early-stage venture investors are less investors with a capital I and more like talent scouts with a checkbook. So we care a lot about that, extraordinary founders.
So we do have someone who's put in a comment to say that both the Nest and Evoke founders are CMU alumni. So we were excited about that.
Matt Rogers, who was the co-founder of Nest, the technical founder, and has been just an amazing partner to Prime in our earliest years, is a boon for this institution. Wonderful human being.
So I think we have time for two questions, so I'm going to merge them together.
Sure.
So do you have any unique insights on how you develop your pipeline? And then once you've picked a company, how do you help them become successful beyond investing, if at all?
Excellent question. So on pipe, right, we are maybe over-engineered even in how we assess startups. So if we are taking, as Jay pointed out in his question, money from foundations and philanthropists who have a motive that they want their funding to be renewable, but primarily they want to see social change brought into the world, what does that mean? It means we have to look at everything. It would be very inappropriate for us to turn to a Midwestern foundation that's participated in our fund and say, by the way, we only look at companies from coastal tech centers because that's where the only good stuff ever comes out of, right? That's both factually inaccurate. It's really dangerous in this field because in these industrial technologies, the centers of innovation often are not the San Francisco Bay or Boston's Route 128. But then third, it's not doing right, by a source of capital that expects us to be as inclusive as possible. So we actually maintain a registry. It's not perfect, but we try to get all seed, Series A, Series B stage companies in energy, agriculture, waste, and water. At any given time, that registry is on the order of 2,500 projects, and they are screened for climate impact, suitability for our impact-driven capital, and a lot of other things. And we do our best to maintain that cycle annually. So we look really broadly. With that said, I think not unlike other fields of endeavor, the highest proportion of things we get really interested in that are a good match for those things are usually warm referred by somebody that we know. Why is that? Because if you're an extraordinary entrepreneur, you've probably found out who we are even if we don't know you, and you're probably smart and crafty enough to find some path, even if it's indirect, to us. Not in every case, right? There are folks that we've met who we've sort of found and engaged and built a relationship with, but that's definitely the minority. In terms of, how to be helpful, early stage venture investing, at least in the places where we do it. If you're doing quantitative sort of internet seed investing where, 500 startups, right? A really prominent fund in this field is named 500 startups for a reason. You invest in lots of things and you try to, with very high leverage, make recommendations and suggestions. But, it's not like you're spending huge amounts of time with every CEO. You couldn't at that level of scale. Our work is really the opposite. We tend to be investing in projects that because they're a little too early and a little too risky for conventional venture, they're almost always first-time entrepreneurs. They're usually incomplete teams. More often than not, there are either beachhead market, path to market, partner questions that are not resolved at the time of the pitch. And these are CEOs who are extraordinary, but they may have been operating in a bit of a vacuum or they may have been operating in one where they're getting lots of conflicting advice from folks who don't have skin in the game of success. And a big role for us is to be shoulder to shoulder as much as we can, with CEOs on things where we can be helpful. That's not their technology. They're going to forget more than we'll ever know, about the electric plane or about the cooling system or about the reverse combustion device. We can help them when it comes to things like recruiting, building culture, fundraising, protecting IP, and we spend a lot of time on those things. Anyway, thanks a lot. I look forward to some discussion with you folks over drinks.
Thank you.